It was a rainy Thursday morning when Thomas walked into the Pearl and Vine bistro. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh croissants. The clinking of cups, the low hum of conversation, and the jazz music playing softly overhead created an ambience of quiet sophistication. Thomas, a man in his mid-50s, was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his Rolex glinting every time he reached for his phone. He was known as one of the wealthiest men in the city, owner of multiple tech firms and real estate empires. A man who spoke rarely, but when he did, people listened. His eyes were always calculating, always observing. Not out of warmth, but control. Thomas was not cruel, at least not obviously. But he was indifferent, distant, and transactional. Emotions were weaknesses, and compassion was, to him, an inefficient currency. He sat at his usual corner table, away from the windows. He hated the rain. The drops made the world look dirty and smeared. He ordered his espresso and almond croissant without lifting his eyes from his phone. Outside, a girl no older than 9 stood at the entrance. Her clothes were soaked. Her thin, faded dress clung to her small frame. Her shoes, if they could be called that, were worn-out flats with holes that had clearly given up resisting the weather. She clutched a small piece of cardboard with trembling hands. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "Please help. I'm hungry." Her name was Eva. And she had been on the streets for 3 days now. No one really noticed her. The bistro was not the kind of place where people looked at poverty in the face. It was a place of business meetings, brunch dates, and power lunches. The girl stood there, her wide eyes scanning each person, hoping someone, anyone, would look at her, would care. And then she started crying. Silent tears at first. Then sniffles. Her whole body shook from the cold, and finally, her sobs broke free. Thomas looked up from his phone, irritated by the noise. His eyes locked on the girl for a moment. She looked back, hope flickering for a heartbeat. He sighed and returned to his phone. Across the room, a waiter named Adrian noticed the entire scene. Adrian had been working at Pearl and Vine for 3 years now. He wasn't supposed to be on shift that day. He had traded with another server because he needed the morning hours free the next day to take his mother to a hospital appointment. Adrian wasn't wealthy. He wasn't powerful. But he was kind. And he remembered what it felt like to be invisible. He placed the pot of coffee he was carrying on a nearby table and walked to the door. The girl flinched as he approached, but he knelt to her level, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Hey there," he said, offering her a soft smile. "You okay?" She shook her head. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded, tears still flowing. Without hesitation, he stood and opened the door wide. "Come on in." The maitre d' raised his eyebrows from behind the reception desk. This was a place that prided itself on exclusivity. But Adrian didn't care. Not in that moment. He led her to a booth near the kitchen where it was warmest and pulled out a chair for her. He fetched a thick clean towel from the kitchen, handed it to her, then rushed to the back to prepare something. Within minutes, he returned with a plate of warm pancakes, scrambled eggs, toast, and a cup of hot chocolate with whipped cream. Eva stared at the food like it was a dream. Her hands trembled as she picked up the fork, unsure if it was truly hers to eat. Adrian nodded reassuringly. "It's all for you," he said. Across the room, Thomas glanced up, disapprovingly. He wasn't the only one. A few of the patrons exchanged whispers. One woman even raised her hand to summon the manager. But before anything could be said, Adrian walked up to Thomas's table with his espresso and croissant. Thomas gave him a look. "That look. You do realize this is not a shelter, right?" Thomas said, coldly. "Yes, sir," Adrian replied calmly. "But I also realize that sometimes, people need more than just food. They need someone to see them." Thomas snorted and went back to his coffee. As the morning passed, Adrian kept checking on Eva. Slowly, she stopped shaking. Slowly, she began to smile. He learned that her mother had died 6 months ago. Her father had disappeared years before that. She had bounced from one relative to another before ending up alone on the streets when her last guardian was arrested for theft. No school. No home. No help. Adrian sat with her for 10 minutes when his shift allowed. He offered her more food. She shook her head. She was full. "You can't stay on the streets," he said gently. "I don't know where else to go," she whispered. That day, after his shift ended, Adrian didn't go home. He took her to a nearby shelter he trusted, one where a friend of his volunteered. He vouched for her, made sure they had space, and stayed until she was safely checked in. But he didn't stop there. Over the next weeks, Adrian visited the shelter every few days. He brought her books, school supplies, new clothes. He helped her with her reading, math, and even got her into a local after-school program that provided tutoring and meals. He even started a GoFundMe for her education and shelter needs. The campaign didn't gain much traction. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the customers who had witnessed the entire event at Pearl and Vine, a quiet woman in her late 40s, wrote a blog post about it. She described everything in vivid detail: the crying girl, the indifferent millionaire, and the waiter who chose kindness over protocol. The post went viral. Suddenly, donations started pouring in. People were moved by Adrian's actions. News outlets picked up the story. Interviews followed. Adrian was invited on a morning show. His GoFundMe raised over $50,000 in a week. But he didn't spend a dime on himself. Every cent went toward helping Eva and other children like her. He partnered with the shelter to create a new program called the Eva Fund. It provided food, tutoring, clothes, and even therapy for kids who had been through trauma. Pearl and Vine received waves of both criticism and praise. Criticism for their initial coldness. Praise for not firing Adrian. Thomas saw the news. He read the blogs. He watched the clips. At first, he dismissed it as sentimentality. But slowly, something shifted. One afternoon, weeks after the incident, Thomas walked into the bistro as usual. But this time, he asked for Adrian. Adrian approached, expecting another lecture. But Thomas didn't complain. He didn't look annoyed. "I'd like to donate," he said simply. Adrian was taken aback. "To the Eva Fund," Thomas clarified. 50,000. For now. Adrian blinked. "You don't have to." "I know," Thomas interrupted. "I want to." He reached into his inner coat pocket and handed over a check. And then, to Adrian's complete shock, Thomas added, "And I'd like to volunteer. Once a week. Math tutoring, maybe. I was good at math." Adrian studied the man. And for the first time, Thomas looked human. Eva thrived. With the support from Adrian and now dozens of volunteers, she returned to school, aced her tests, and even won a citywide poetry contest. She wrote a piece titled, "The Waiter Who Saw Me." It ended like this. "He didn't have riches. He didn't wear a crown. But when I was drowning in silence, he knelt down. He saw me. And now the world sees me too." Years passed. Eva grew into a confident, intelligent young woman. She graduated with honors, studied social work, and started her own foundation to help children living on the streets. And at her graduation, she looked into the crowd, saw Adrian standing there, tears in his eyes, and she ran into his arms. "You saved me," she whispered. But Adrian shook his head. "No," he said. "You saved me. Sometimes, it takes just one person. One moment of courage. One act of compassion to light a fire that burns across lifetimes." Adrian had no power, no wealth, and no spotlight. But his choice to act, to care, changed the course of a little girl's life, and in doing so, changed many others. And Thomas? He became one of the most generous donors to children's shelters in the region. But more than that, he became someone who no longer looked away. All because one waiter chose kindness over convenience. So remember, your smallest act of compassion may be the miracle someone else has been praying for. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And most of all, stay kind.